Blood trickled down Eleanor Larson's pale cheek as she stumbled through the Montana wilderness, her breath forming clouds in the crisp autumn air of 1878. The purple-yellow bruises on her arms and face told a story she'd kept hidden for too long behind closed doors and practiced smiles in the mining town of Dillon. Tonight had been different tonight. She had finally run. The distant sound of hoofbeats made her heart hammer against her ribcage. Charles would have discovered her absence by now. Eleanor ducked behind a large boulder, pressing her trembling body against the cold stone. Her cotton dress, once sky blue and pristine when she'd married Charles Larson 2 years ago, was now torn and spattered with mud and blood, some his, mostly hers. The hoofbeats grew louder. She held her breath, clutching the small knife she'd stolen from their kitchen table. Her fingers, once delicate and made for playing the piano in her father's home, now calloused and scarred from accidents, tightened around the handle. "Hello? Is someone there?" The voice wasn't Charles's. It was deeper, softer somehow, despite its volume. Eleanor remained silent, pressing herself further against the rock, willing herself to disappear. "Madam, I saw someone running from the road. Are you hurt?" The stranger's boots crunched on fallen leaves as he approached her hiding place. Eleanor's grip on the knife tightened, knuckles white with strain. When he came around the boulder, she thrust the knife forward with a strangled cry. The tall man jumped back, his hand reflexively moving to the revolver on his hip, but stopping short of drawing it. His eyes widened as he took in her appearance, the bruises, the torn dress, the wild fear in her eyes. "Whoa there," he said, raising both hands slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you, madam." Eleanor kept the knife pointed at him, her hands shaking. "Leave me be," she whispered hoarsely. The stranger stood still, his weathered face illuminated in the moonlight. He wore a worn leather duster and a hat that had seen better days, the silver star on his chest catching the moonlight. "I'm Deputy Ross Harrington," he said calmly, "and you look like you need help." His eyes traveled over her bruises, lingering on the fresh cut on her cheek. "He'll come looking for me," she said, tears threatening to spill. "My husband," understanding dawned in Deputy Harrington's eyes. "He did this to you." Eleanor nodded once, the simple motion sending pain shooting through her neck where Charles had grabbed her earlier that night. "You're safe now," the deputy said, his voice hardening with conviction. "I won't let him near you." "You don't understand," Eleanor whispered, lowering the knife slightly. "Charles has friends in town, important friends." "I don't care if he's friends with the president himself," Deputy Harrington replied. "Any man who lays his hands on a woman like that will have to kill me first before he gets to you again." Something in his tone, the quiet certainty, perhaps made Eleanor believe him, even as her mind told her no one could stand against Charles Larson and his mining connections. "My horse is just over there," he continued, gesturing toward the road. "I can take you to my cabin outside of town. You'll be safe there until we figure things out." "Why would you help me?" Eleanor asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Life had taught her that men seldom offered help without expecting something in return. "Because it's right," he answered simply. "And because no one helped my mother when she needed it." Eleanor searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity in his brown eyes. Slowly, she lowered the knife completely. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." Eleanor had grown up on a farm in Missouri before meeting Charles at a town social. Riding had been one of the few joys Charles hadn't managed to take from her yet. Deputy Harrington nodded and slowly extended his hand. "I won't touch you unless you say it's all right." The consideration in that statement nearly broke her. Eleanor swallowed hard and took his offered hand, feeling its warmth and strength as he helped her stand. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly. "Eleanor Larson." "Well, Miss Eleanor, Let's get you somewhere safe." The deputy led her to his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding that nickered softly as they approached. He helped her mount, being careful not to touch her more than necessary, then swung up behind her. As they rode away from Dylan, Eleanor felt both terror and relief warring inside her. Behind them lay everything she'd known for the past 2 years: her home, her few possessions, the life she'd built despite Charles's cruelty. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also, perhaps, safety. What she didn't know was that Charles Larson had already organized a search party. As the mine owner's son and the town's most prosperous businessman, he commanded respect and fear from most of Dylan's residents. By morning, a dozen men would be scouring the countryside for his confused and delicate wife, who had, according to Charles, suffered a breakdown and run away during a spell of hysteria. And Charles Larson always found what belonged to him. Deputy Harrington's cabin sat nestled among pine trees about 5 miles outside of town, far enough from the main road to avoid casual discovery. It was small but sturdy, built with his own hands over the course of 2 summers. "It's not much," he said as he helped Eleanor dismount, "but it's warm and dry." Eleanor looked at the cabin with weary eyes. After riding for nearly an hour, her body ached from the bruises and the exertion. "It's perfect," she whispered. Inside, the cabin was simple but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a small kitchen area occupied another, and a narrow bed sat in the corner. A table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the single room. "You can take the bed," Ross said, already moving to light a fire. "I'll sleep by the fire." Eleanor stood awkwardly near the door, suddenly intensely aware of being alone with a man she'd just met. But something about Deputy Harrington's quiet efficiency put her at ease. He didn't hover or stare. He simply went about making the cabin comfortable. "There's water in that pitcher if you want to clean up," he said, nodding toward a basin on a small stand. "And I have a spare shirt you can wear. It'll be too big, but it's clean." "Thank you," Eleanor said, the words feeling inadequate for the kindness he was showing. When the fire was crackling, Ross took his hat off, revealing thick brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. Without the shadow of his hat brim, his face looked younger, though the lines around his eyes spoke of a man who'd seen his share of hardship. "I need to tend to my horse," he said. "Take your time. There's food in the cupboard if you're hungry." Once alone, Eleanor approached the water basin, catching sight of her reflection in the small mirror hanging above it. She hardly recognized herself. Her honey-blonde hair hung in tangled disarray around her face, which was marred by the bruise blooming on her left cheekbone and the cut that had finally stopped bleeding. Her blue eyes, once bright and hopeful, now looked haunted. She washed as best she could with the cold water, wincing as she touched the tender spots on her skin. The deputy's shirt was worn soft with age, smelling faintly of pine and soap when she pulled it over her head. It hung almost to her knees, but it was clean and whole, unlike her torn dress. By the time Ross returned, Eleanor had settled into one of the chairs at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of water. "Are you hungry?" he asked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Eleanor nodded, suddenly realizing she hadn't eaten since noon the previous day. Ross set about preparing a simple meal of beans, bacon, and biscuits left over from his breakfast. As he worked, Eleanor studied him. He moved with an economy of motion, no wasted gestures or nervous energy. His hands were large and capable, but they handled the tin plates with surprising gentleness. "How long have you been deputy?" she asked, breaking the silence. 3 years, he replied, glancing over his shoulder. "Came to Dylan after the war, needed a fresh start. You fought in the war." He nodded. "Union cavalry. Wasn't much more than a boy when I enlisted." Eleanor could see it now, the military bearing he still carried, the way he assessed situations with calm efficiency. And before that, farm boy from Ohio, he said with a small smile. Nothing special. I'm from Missouri, Eleanor offered. My father had a small farm outside of Springfield. What brought you to Montana? Ross asked, setting a plate of food in front of her. Eleanor stared at the plate, memories washing over her. Charles, she said softly. He came through Springfield looking for investments in 1876. He was so charming, so different from the farm boys I knew. She gave a bitter laugh. My father thought I was making a good match. Charles promised him I'd be well taken care of. Ross sat across from her with his own plate. When did he start hurting you? Eleanor pushed the beans around her plate. The first time was 3 months after we married. He apologized so sweetly afterward, bought me a beautiful brooch. She touched her collar absently. The second time was a month later. Then it became more frequent. By the time we moved to Dillon last year, it was happening every week. Why tonight? Ross asked quietly. What made you run tonight? Eleanor met his eyes, her own filling with tears. I'm with child, she whispered. I've lost 2 already from his. Attentions. I couldn't lose another. I couldn't. Ross's jaw tightened, his knuckles white around his fork. How far along? About 3 months. I've been hiding it, but he found out today. He was so angry, said he didn't want a child yet, that I'd done it on purpose to trap him further. Her voice broke. He kicked me, right here. She placed a protective hand over her stomach. I knew I had to leave or he'd kill us both. Ross set down his fork, his expression dark. Miss Eleanor, I swear to you he will never touch you again. You don't know Charles, she said sadly. He doesn't give up what he considers his property. You are not property, Ross said firmly. You're a person and you have the right to live without fear. Eleanor wanted desperately to believe him. What happens now? You rest, Ross said. Tomorrow I'll go into town to check what's happening and bring back supplies. We'll figure out the next steps then. He'll have men looking for me, Eleanor warned. Important men. The mayor, the banker, even the sheriff sometimes plays cards with Charles. Ross's eyebrows rose. Sheriff Morris, Eleanor nodded. They're friendly. Charles has invested in many businesses in town. That complicates things, Ross admitted, but I still have friends who will help. We'll find a way to keep you safe. After they finished eating, Ross made up a pallet for himself near the fire while Eleanor took the bed, wrapping herself in the worn quilt that smelled of pine and fresh air. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her for a long time. Every creak of the cabin settling, every hoot of an owl outside sent her heart racing. But eventually, the steady sound of Ross's breathing and the crackling fire lulled her into a fitful sleep. Her last conscious thought was that for the first time in nearly 2 years, she wouldn't wake to Charles's unpredictable moods. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the cabin's single window. Eleanor woke disoriented, momentarily panicked until she remembered where she was. The cabin was quiet. Ross's pallet by the fire was empty and neatly folded. She found a note on the table. Gone to check on things in town. Stay inside. There's food in the cupboard. I'll be back by noon. Eleanor moved stiffly to the water basin, her body protesting after the previous night's exertions. The bruises had darkened overnight, a roadmap of Charles's anger painted across her skin. She touched her stomach gently, whispering a prayer that the baby had survived. After washing and dressing, she set about tidying the already neat cabin, needing to occupy her hands. She found coffee in the cupboard and set water to boil on the small stove, the familiar motions providing comfort in their normalcy. As she waited for the water to heat, she explored the cabin more thoroughly. A small bookshelf held a surprising collection: Whitman, Emerson, even a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. A tin-type photograph on the shelf showed a young Ross in his Union uniform, standing beside an older woman with his same serious eyes. His mother, Eleanor, guessed. Another photo showed Ross with 3 other men in lawman's attire, all looking solemn for the camera. A third picture, older and more faded, was of a young woman with dark hair, her expression serene. Eleanor was studying this last photo when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. The coffee forgotten, she moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtain. Relief flooded her when she saw it was Ross returning, but it quickly turned to concern at the tight expression on his face as he dismounted. Eleanor opened the door as he approached, carrying saddlebags and a small crate. "What's happened?" Ross set his burdens down on the table before answering. "Your husband has half the town searching for you," he said grimly. "He's telling everyone you're unwell, that pregnancy has affected your mind." Eleanor felt sick. "Did anyone see you coming here?" "No, I was careful," Ross assured her. "But he's offered a $100 reward for information leading to your return." $100, Eleanor whispered, shocked. That was more money than most people in Dillon saw in months. "People will be looking everywhere." "Which is why we need to move," Ross said. "I have a friend with a place farther north, near the Canadian border. You'll be safer there until we can figure out a more permanent solution." Eleanor questioned softly. Ross met her eyes. "I gave you my word, Miss Eleanor. I won't abandon you to face him alone." "But your job, your life here, is not worth a woman's safety," he finished firmly. "Besides, I've been considering a change for a while now. This just moves up my timetable." Eleanor felt overwhelmed by his selflessness. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Live free and raise that child in peace," Ross said simply. "That'll be payment enough." He began unpacking the supplies he'd brought: food, warm clothing that might fit her, and a small revolver that he placed on the table between them. "You know how to use one of these?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head. "Charles never allowed me near firearms." "I'll teach you," Ross said. "Out here, everyone should know how to protect themselves." As he explained the basic operation of the revolver, Eleanor tried to focus, but her mind kept returning to the enormity of what was happening. She was leaving everything behind, fleeing with a man she barely knew to escape the husband who had sworn to cherish and protect her. "When do we leave?" she asked when Ross had finished his explanation. "Tomorrow at first light," he replied. "We'll travel north through the mountains. It's slower but safer than the main roads. It'll take us about 10 days to reach my friend Jacob's place." Eleanor nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach again. 10 days on horseback while pregnant would be challenging, but the alternative was unthinkable. "There's something else," Ross said, his expression grim. "Charles is claiming you stole money and jewelry from him before you left." Eleanor gasped. "That's a lie. I took nothing but the clothes on my back." "I believe you," Ross assured her. "But it means he's escalating this from a husband looking for his confused wife to a man seeking a thief. It gives him more leverage with the law. He's trying to ensure I'll be brought back in chains if found," Eleanor realized, her voice hollow. Ross nodded grimly. "Which is why we need to be extra careful. I've told Sheriff Morris I'm taking a few weeks to visit a sick relative." He was suspicious, but with the deputy from the north end of the county coming in to help, he didn't press too hard. Eleanor shuddered, wondering what Charles would do if he found her. The bruises on her body throbbed as if in answer. "Try not to worry," Ross said gently, misreading her silence. "We'll be well away before anyone thinks to look this far from town." What neither of them knew was that at that very moment, Charles Larson was questioning a stable boy who had seen Deputy Harrington buying supplies and packing for what looked like a long journey. The stable boy hadn't thought much of it until Charles slipped a silver dollar into his palm and asked if the deputy had been acting strangely. "Well, sir," the boy had said, pocketing the coin, "he did ask about trails north that avoid the main roads. Said something about visiting a sick relative." Charles had smiled, the expression never reaching his cold eyes, and pressed another silver dollar into the boy's hand. "You've been very helpful, son. Very helpful indeed." Back at the cabin, Ross was showing Eleanor the map he'd marked with their route. "We'll follow this creek up into the mountains," he explained, tracing a blue line with his finger. "There's a trapper's hut here where we can rest the first night. After that, we'll be camping until we reach this trading post about 5 days in." Eleanor tried to focus on the map, but the reality of their situation kept intruding. "What if he finds us before we leave?" she asked quietly. Ross's expression hardened. "He won't. But if he does, then I'll deal with him," Ross stated firmly. Eleanor studied his face, seeing the determination there. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Ross's expression softened slightly. "Miss Eleanor, I've faced worse than Charles Larson in my time." "Call me Eleanor," she said. "After all this, I think we can dispense with formalities." Ross nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Eleanor, then." The way he said her name with gentle respect made something warm unfurl in her chest. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with kindness rather than condescension or cruelty. As the day progressed, Ross taught Eleanor how to load and fire the small revolver, taking her outside to practice on targets he set up on tree trunks. Her first shots went wild, the recoil stronger than she'd expected. "Brace your wrist more," Ross advised, standing behind her. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her arms. Eleanor nodded, and he carefully adjusted her stance, his touch professional and brief. "Now try." Her next shot hit closer to the mark, and by the 5th attempt she was hitting the target consistently. "Good," Ross said, approval warming his voice. "You're a natural." Eleanor felt an unexpected flush of pride. "My father always said I had a steady hand. He taught me to sew and do fine needlework when I was very young." "Same principle," Ross said. "Steady hands and good eyes." They returned to the cabin as the sun began to set, and Ross set about preparing a more substantial meal than the previous night. "We'll need our strength for tomorrow," he explained. As they ate, Eleanor found herself studying Ross, trying to understand this man who was risking so much for a woman he didn't know. He wasn't classically handsome like Charles, whose golden good looks had turned so many heads. Instead, Ross had a rugged, weathered face that spoke of years outdoors, with deep lines around eyes that missed very little. His brown hair was streaked with early gray at the temples, and a scar ran along his jawline, visible now that he'd shaved. "How old are you, Ross?" she asked suddenly. 34 next month, he replied, looking slightly surprised at the question. "And you?" 23 last spring, Eleanor said. "Sometimes I feel much older." Ross's expression softened. "Hardship ages us faster than years. Is that what happened to you?" she asked, emboldened by his openness. "During the war," Ross was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "The war did its part," he finally said, "but after was harder in some ways. Coming home to find my mother ill, my father gone, trying to save the farm but failing." He shrugged. "Drifted west afterward like many men." "And the woman in the photograph?" Eleanor asked hesitantly. "The one on your shelf?" A shadow crossed Ross's face. "Sarah, my wife." He set down his fork. "She died of typhoid while I was fighting at Gettysburg. I didn't learn of it until I returned 3 months later." "I'm so sorry," Eleanor said, reaching across the table before she could think better of it, her hand covering his. Ross looked down at their hands, then back to her face. "It was a long time ago," he said softly. 12 years this past June. Is that why you're helping me? Eleanor asked. Because you couldn't help her. Ross considered this, turning his hand to briefly squeeze hers before withdrawing. Perhaps partly, he admitted, but mostly because it's right. No one should live in fear of the person who promised to love them. The honesty in his words touched Eleanor deeply. In Charles's world, everything was calculation and advantage, even his occasional moments of tenderness. Ross's straightforward decency was like cool water after years of thirst. After dinner, they continued preparations for the journey. Ross packed carefully, showing Eleanor how to distribute weight evenly in saddlebags. She watched, learning from his methodical approach. "We should try to sleep early," Ross said as darkness fell completely outside. "We'll be leaving before dawn." Eleanor nodded, suddenly exhausted as the day's tension caught up with her. She retreated to the bed while Ross made his pallet by the fire again. Despite her fatigue, sleep came fitfully. Every sound from the forest outside made her tense. Imagining Charles and his men closing in the darkest part of the night, she woke gasping from a nightmare where Charles had found her, his hands around her throat. The fire had burned low, casting the cabin in shadows. Through her panicked breathing, she heard Ross stir. "Eleanor," he called softly. "Are you all right?" "Just a dream," she managed to say, her voice shaking. She heard him rise, the floorboards creaking slightly under his weight. He added wood to the fire, the renewed flames illuminating his concerned face as he turned toward her. "Would you like some water?" Eleanor nodded, wrapping the quilt tighter around herself as if it could shield her from the memories. Ross brought her a cup, keeping a respectful distance as he handed it to her. "Do you want to talk about it?" Eleanor took a sip, the cold water soothing her dry throat. "I dreamed he found me," she whispered. "He was so angry." Ross sat on the edge of the bed, far enough away to give her space but close enough that she could feel his steadying presence. "He won't find you," he promised. "And if he did, he'd have to go through me first." In the firelight, Ross's eyes were deep and sure, and Eleanor found herself believing him despite her fears. "Thank you," she said softly. Ross nodded and returned to his pallet, but neither of them slept much for what remained of the night. They left before the first hint of dawn touched the sky, the forest dark and silent around them as Ross saddled 2 horses, his chestnut gelding, and a sturdy bay mare he'd purchased in town. Eleanor wore men's clothing Ross had brought for her, the pants and shirt offering more practicality for riding than her dress. Her hair was tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, and she wore a coat that was too large but warm against the autumn chill. "Stay close," Ross instructed as they set out. "The trail gets narrow in places." They rode in silence as the forest gradually lightened around them, the first birds beginning to call to each other. Eleanor felt strangely calm despite the circumstances, as if the act of leaving itself had already lightened some of the burden she'd carried for so long. By mid-morning, they had climbed higher into the mountains, following game trails and narrow passes that Ross seemed to know by heart. The views were breathtaking, vast forests stretching to snow-capped peaks, valleys filled with morning mist. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed during a brief stop to rest the horses. Ross, scanning the path behind them, nodded. "Montana has a way of making a person feel small, in a good way." "I never saw much of it," Eleanor admitted. "Charles kept me in town mostly, or at the mine office when he wanted to show me off to investors." Ross's jaw tightened at the mention of Charles, but he kept his voice neutral. "Well, you'll see plenty now." They continued their journey, Ross occasionally pointing out landmarks or telling her about the wildlife they might encounter. His knowledge of the land impressed Eleanor, so different from Charles's interest in what could be extracted from it. By late afternoon, they reached the trapper's cabin Ross had mentioned. a small, sturdy structure tucked against a cliff face. It was basic, just one room with a stone fireplace and crude bunks, but it offered shelter from the increasingly cold wind. "We'll stay here tonight," Ross said, helping Eleanor dismount. Her legs were stiff and sore from the unaccustomed hours of riding, and she stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground. Ross caught her elbow to steady her, his touch gentle. "Are you all right?" Eleanor nodded, embarrassed by her weakness. "Just stiff." "It'll get easier," Ross assured her. "But the first day is always the hardest." While Ross tended to the horses, Eleanor explored the cabin, finding it surprisingly clean for an abandoned structure. A stack of firewood stood ready beside the hearth, and basic supplies, salt, flour, matches were stored in a small cupboard. "Someone maintains this place," she observed when Ross entered with their saddlebags. "Trappers and hunters use it seasonally," Ross explained. "There's an unwritten code in these mountains: leave a place better than you found it, for the next traveler." They worked together to prepare a simple meal, moving around each other with growing ease. Ross showed Eleanor how to make coffee trail style, and praised her when she managed to produce a passable batch of biscuits using the cast iron skillet and the cabin's meager supplies. As they ate, sitting on rough-hewn stools by the fire, Eleanor found herself studying Ross again. There was a quiet competence to everything he did, an assurance born of experience rather than arrogance. He wasn't a handsome man in the conventional way that Charles was, but his features had character strength in the line of his jaw, kindness in the crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, which was rare but transformative. "You're staring," Ross observed, not unkindly. Eleanor blushed, looking down at her plate. "I'm sorry, I was just thinking about," she hesitated, then decided on honesty. "About how different you are from Charles." Ross considered this, taking a sip of his coffee. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It was meant as one," Eleanor assured him. She paused, then added quietly, "I'm not sure I even knew what a good man was anymore until yesterday." Ross's expression softened. "There are plenty of good men in the world, Eleanor. You just had the misfortune to marry one of the bad ones." "My father was a good man," Eleanor said, memories washing over her. "Quiet, hardworking. He never raised his hand to my mother or me, not once. When Charles came courting, so charming and full of big dreams, I think father was dazzled by the opportunities Charles could offer me." Her voice caught. "He would be heartbroken if he knew." "Is he still living?" Ross asked gently. Eleanor shook her head. "He passed last year, pneumonia. Charles wouldn't even let me go to the funeral, said it was too far to travel in winter." Her eyes filled with tears at the memory. "I never got to say goodbye." Ross was quiet for a moment, then said, "My father left us when I was 12. Just walked away one day and never came back. My mother raised me alone after that." His voice held old pain. "When I came home from the war to find her dying, I promised her I'd try to be the kind of man she raised me to be. I don't always succeed, but I try." "She would be proud of you," Eleanor said softly. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something shifted in the air, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who had known loss and were still trying to find their way. Ross cleared his throat and stood, breaking the moment. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." They arranged their sleeping areas, Ross insisting Eleanor take the more comfortable of the two bunks while he took the one with a broken slat. Despite her exhaustion, Eleanor lay awake for some time, listening to the wind outside and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Her thoughts drifted to Charles. By now, he would be furious, his search expanding beyond Dylan. Would he guess which direction they had gone? Would he follow? The questions circled in her mind, but strangely, The fear that had been her constant companion for so long felt more distant here, with miles of wilderness between them and Ross's steady presence nearby. Her hand moved to her stomach, where the small life inside her continued to grow despite everything. "We'll be all right," she whispered to her unborn child. "Somehow, we'll be all right." She drifted to sleep with that fragile hope cradled in her heart, unaware that 20 miles to the south, Charles Larson was gathering a group of 6 men, not the law-abiding search party he'd organized for public show, but hard men who owed him favors and wouldn't ask questions. Men who understood that, when Charles Larson wanted something returned to him, it came back by any means necessary. The morning dawned clear and cold, frost sparkling on the ground outside the trapper's cabin. Ross was already up when Eleanor woke, preparing a simple breakfast and checking their supplies. "Sleep well?" he asked, handing her a cup of hot coffee. "Better than I expected," Eleanor admitted, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm tin cup. She had slept deeply once she'd finally drifted off, the physical exhaustion of the previous day's ride overcoming her anxiety. "Good. We have a challenging path today, steeper terrain, narrower trails." Ross studied her face. "If it gets too difficult, we can rest more often." "I'll be fine," Eleanor assured him, touched by his concern but determined not to slow them down. "I'm stronger than I look." A smile flickered across Ross's face. "I don't doubt that for a second." They set out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The trail did indeed grow steeper, winding through dense pine forests that occasionally opened to reveal spectacular vistas of valleys and distant peaks. By midday, they had climbed high enough that Eleanor could see for miles in every direction. During a brief stop to rest the horses, she gazed back the way they had come, her eyes tracking the distant ribbon of the river they had followed out of Dillon. "Can you see the town from here?" she asked. Ross shook his head. "It's too far now and the ridge blocks the view, but we're making good progress." He handed her a strip of dried beef and a biscuit from their provisions. "Eat something. You need to keep up your strength." Eleanor accepted the food gratefully. The constant motion of riding had awakened her appetite in a way she hadn't experienced in months. Under Charles's watchful eye, she had eaten sparingly, knowing he preferred her slender, even as the pregnancy had begun to make her hungry for more substantial meals. "What will happen when we reach your friend's place?" she asked after they had eaten and remounted. Ross adjusted his hat against the midday sun. "Jacob has a ranch near the Canadian border. It's isolated, well protected. You can stay there until the baby comes at least. And then—" Ross was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Then you'll have choices," he finally said. "Jacob knows people in Canada. You could start fresh there where Charles has no influence." Eleanor considered this. Canada seemed impossibly distant, a foreign land where she knew no one. But perhaps that was the point, to go somewhere Charles would never think to look. "Would you?" She began, then hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. Ross glanced at her questioningly. "Would you go to Canada too?" She finally asked, surprising herself with how much she wanted him to say yes. Ross's expression was unreadable. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he said carefully. "For now, let's focus on reaching Jacob safely." The non-answer stung more than Eleanor expected. Of course, Ross had his own life, his own plans. He was helping her out of decency, not because of any deeper connection. The realization made her feel suddenly foolish. They rode in silence for the next hour, the trail narrowing as they crossed a ridge that dropped steeply on both sides. Eleanor focused on keeping her mare steady, pushing away thoughts of the future to concentrate on the present challenge. When they reached a small plateau on the other side, Ross called a halt. "The horses need water," he explained, dismounting beside a clear stream that tumbled down from higher ground. Eleanor slid carefully from her saddle, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. 3 days ago, she had been a miner's wife in Dillon, planning dinner and avoiding her husband's temper. Now she was a fugitive in the wilderness, her future as uncertain as the weather in these mountains. As she stretched her legs, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over her. She reached for a nearby pine tree to steady herself, but the world tilted alarmingly. "Ross," she called weakly, her voice barely audible over the bubbling stream. He turned, alarm crossing his face as he saw her swaying. In 3 long strides he was at her side, his strong arm supporting her waist. "Sit down," he said firmly, helping her to a fallen log. "Put your head between your knees." Eleanor complied, the dizziness gradually receding. When she finally raised her head, Ross was kneeling before her, his face creased with concern. "When did you last eat a full meal? Before we left, I mean." Eleanor tried to remember. "The morning before I ran," she admitted. "Charles was angry at dinner that night, and then yesterday everything happened so quickly." Ross muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse. "You're eating for 2, Eleanor. You need regular, substantial meals." He reached into his saddlebag and produced an apple and more dried meat. "Eat this, all of it. Then we'll rest here longer before continuing." The genuine concern in his voice brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. She blinked them away, focusing on the food. "I'm not used to someone worrying about my well-being," she said softly. Ross's expression darkened. "Well, get used to it," he said gruffly. "I won't have you fainting off your horse because you're too proud or too conditioned to speak up when you need something." The rebuke, gentle as it was, reminded Eleanor of her father's occasional stern moments born of care, not cruelty. She nodded and ate obediently, the food reviving her strength. They rested by the stream for nearly an hour, Ross filling their water skins and checking the horse's shoes while Eleanor sat with her back against a sun-warmed rock, the tension gradually leaving her body. "We won't make it to the next shelter I had planned," Ross said as he helped her back onto her mare. "There's a protected hollow about 3 miles ahead where we can make camp for the night." Eleanor nodded, embarrassed that her weakness had altered their plans but grateful for Ross's matter-of-fact adjustment. Charles would have berated her for days if she had caused such an inconvenience. The afternoon passed more slowly as Ross set an easier pace, regularly checking that Eleanor was steady in her saddle. The forest around them grew denser, the pine trees giving way to a mix of aspen and fir. Gold and crimson leaves drifted down around them, marking the advancing autumn. By the time they reached the hollow Ross had mentioned, the sun was sinking behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the small clearing. A semicircle of rocky outcroppings provided shelter on 3 sides, with a small stream running nearby. "It's not as comfortable as the cabin," Ross said as he helped Eleanor dismount, "but it's defensible and hidden from the trail." Eleanor looked around at the sheltered space. "It's perfect," she assured him, though the prospect of sleeping outdoors made her nervous. She had never camped in her life. Even on the journey west with Charles, they had always stayed in hotels or with business associates. Ross seemed to read her thoughts. "I'll build a lean-to against those rocks," he said, pointing. "It'll keep the wind off and reflect the fire's heat. You'll be warm enough." He worked efficiently, cutting young saplings and arranging them against the rock face, then covering the frame with pine boughs to create a simple shelter. Eleanor helped as best she could, gathering kindling for the fire and arranging their bedrolls inside the lean-to. As darkness fell, they sat beside the small fire Ross had built, eating a hot meal of beans and salt pork. The stars emerged overhead, more brilliant than Eleanor had ever seen them. "It's beautiful," she said, gazing upward. "In Dillon, you can see stars, but not like this." Ross followed her gaze. "Out here, there's nothing to dim them, no lamps, no smoke from chimneys." He pointed upward. "See that cluster there? That's the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, and over there is Cassiopeia." "How do you know so much about the stars?" Eleanor asked, charmed by this unexpected knowledge. "My grandfather taught me," Ross replied. "He was a sea captain before he settled in Ohio. Said a man who can read the stars will never truly be lost." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, the night creatures beginning their evening chorus around the clearing. "Tell me about your life before Charles," Ross said eventually. "What did Eleanor Larson like to do before she became Mrs. Larson?" The question caught Eleanor by surprise. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her preferences, her joys. Charles had never been interested in who she had been before him. "I love to read," she said slowly, memories surfacing. "My father had a small collection of books, Dickens, Austen, some poetry. I read them over and over, and I played the piano. Not brilliantly, but well enough that people sometimes asked me to play at church socials." "You still read?" Ross asked. Eleanor shook her head. "Charles said it gave me fanciful ideas. He burned my books when I disagreed with him about something 6 months ago." Ross's expression hardened. "What a waste," he said quietly, "of the books and of your spirit." "I'm finding it again," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "Out here away from him, I can feel parts of myself waking up that I thought were gone forever." Ross smiled, the expression warming his serious face. "Good. That's good to hear." As the fire burned lower, Eleanor found herself yawning despite her best efforts to stay alert. "Get some rest," Ross said, noticing her fatigue. "I'll keep watch for a while." "You need sleep too," Eleanor protested. "I'll wake you for the second watch," Ross promised, though Eleanor suspected he had no intention of doing so. Inside the lean-to, wrapped in her bedroll and a blanket Ross had insisted she take, Eleanor listened to the night sounds, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the soft nickering of the horses tethered nearby. Despite the unfamiliar setting, she felt safer than she had in her own bed in Dillon. She fell asleep watching Ross's silhouette against the dying fire, his rifle across his knees as he scanned the darkness beyond their small circle of safety. Eleanor woke to gray dawn light filtering through the pine boughs of their shelter. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar sounds and smells of the forest confusing her sleep-muddled mind. Then memory returned, the escape, the journey, Ross. She sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles from yesterday's ride and the night on the hard ground. Outside the lean-to, she could hear movement, the quiet efficiency of Ross preparing for the day. When she emerged, rubbing sleep from her eyes, Ross was already saddling the horses. He glanced up, a brief smile crossing his face. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's by the fire if you want some." Eleanor murmured her thanks, moving to the small fire where a pot of coffee simmered on the stones. She poured some into a tin cup, grateful for the warmth and the jolt of alertness it provided. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, noting the shadows under Ross's eyes. "Enough," he replied, which Eleanor took to mean hardly at all. "We should reach the trading post by nightfall if we make good time today." Eleanor nodded, appreciating the prospect of a real roof and perhaps a proper bed. Her back ached from the combination of riding and sleeping on the ground, though she was determined not to complain. They ate a quick breakfast of hardtack and dried fruit, then broke camp efficiently. Ross had taught Eleanor how to erase signs of their presence, scattering the ashes of their fire, brushing over their footprints, removing all traces that might guide pursuit. As they mounted up to leave, Ross suddenly went still, his head tilting as if listening intently. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her heart beginning to race. Ross held up a hand for silence, his expression intent. After a long moment, he relaxed slightly. "Nothing," he said. "Thought I heard something, but it must have been an animal." They set out, following a trail that wound deeper into the mountains. The day was warmer than the previous one, sunlight filtering through the trees to create dappled patterns on the forest floor. Under different circumstances, Eleanor might have found the journey pleasant, the beauty of the wilderness, the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath her, the companionable silence she shared with Ross. But anxiety nagged at her, intensifying whenever Ross paused to scan their back trail or listen to the sounds of the forest. He was being more vigilant today, she noticed, though he tried to hide his concern from her. Around midday, as they stopped to water the horses at a small stream, Eleanor finally voiced her fears. "Someone's following us, aren't they?" Ross looked up sharply from where he was filling their water skins. For a moment he seemed about to deny it, then his expression softened. "I'm not certain," he admitted, "but yes, I think someone might be on our trail." Eleanor's hand moved protectively to her stomach, fear washing over her. "Charles, possibly," Ross said grimly, "or men working for him. I've seen signs of pursuit since this morning, broken branches that weren't wildlife, tracks that were covered over but not well enough." "What do we do?" Eleanor asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Ross straightened, his expression resolute. "We change our plan. There's a place about 3 miles from here, an old mining camp tucked into a narrow canyon. It's defensible, and there's only one way in or out. I've used it before when tracking fugitives who didn't want to be found." "You mean we stop running and make a stand?" Eleanor asked, dismayed. "No," Ross said firmly. "I mean we hide your trail completely, make them think we've gone a different direction and wait them out at the camp. They'll pass by, following the false trail, and we can continue north once they're gone." The plan made sense, but fear still clutched at Eleanor's heart. "What if they find us anyway?" Ross's hand moved to the revolver at his hip. "Then I'll deal with them," he said, his voice hardening. "I meant what I said, Eleanor. Anyone who wants to hurt you will have to go through me first." The quiet certainty in his voice calmed her somewhat. Ross was not a man who made empty promises, she had learned. They mounted up again, but instead of continuing on the trail, Ross led them into the stream, riding upstream for nearly a mile before emerging on a rocky bank that would show no tracks. From there, they picked their way carefully across a field of boulders, leaving no trace of their passage. The old mining camp was exactly as Ross had described, a collection of dilapidated wooden structures nestled in a narrow canyon, hidden from view until you were almost upon it. The largest building, once the assay office, was still relatively intact, its roof mostly whole despite the years of abandonment. "We'll stay here," Ross decided, helping Eleanor dismount. "Take the horses to the back where they can't be seen from the canyon entrance." While Eleanor tended to the tired animals, Ross quickly explored the camp, checking for signs of recent occupation and assessing the best defensive positions. When he returned, his expression was grim but determined. "There's a root cellar under the assay office," he told her. "If trouble comes, that's where you'll hide. There's a trapdoor under the main desk that's not obvious unless you know to look for it." Eleanor nodded, the reality of their situation sinking in. This was no longer just a journey through beautiful wilderness. It was a desperate flight from danger that might be closing in even now. They moved their supplies into the assay office, Ross insisting that they leave everything packed for a quick departure if necessary. The interior was dusty but dry, with an old cast-iron stove that Ross deemed safe enough to use for heating. "No cooking until dark," he cautioned. "Smoke might be seen." As afternoon faded toward evening, Ross grew increasingly tense, repeatedly checking their surroundings and listening for sounds of approach. Eleanor tried to keep busy, organizing their supplies and brushing down the horses, but anxiety made her movements jerky and uncoordinated. "You should eat something," Ross said, noticing her distraction. "Keep up your strength." Eleanor nodded absently, accepting the dried beef and hardtack he offered but finding it difficult to swallow past the lump of fear in her throat. As darkness fell, Ross finally built a small fire in the stove, keeping it minimal but enough to ward off the growing chill. The warm glow illuminated his worried face as he cleaned his rifle with methodical care. "Tell me about Jacob," Eleanor said suddenly, needing conversation to distract her from her fears. "Your friend we're going to meet." Ross glanced up, seeming to understand her need for normalcy. "Jacob Freeman. We served together in the war same company, though he was a sergeant while I was just a private. He saved my life at Chickamauga when a Confederate sharpshooter had me in his sights." "He sounds brave," Eleanor said. "Brave and stubborn," Ross agreed with a slight smile. "After the war, he came west before I did. Married a Blackfoot woman named Morning Star and built a ranch on land her family claimed. They have 3 children now, 2 boys and a girl." The image of a family, peaceful and safe on their ranch, made Eleanor's throat tight with longing. Would she ever know such security, such normalcy? "What's his wife like, Morning Star?" she asked. "Strong," Ross said immediately. "Intelligent. She speaks 4 languages and runs the ranch as much as Jacob does. You'll like her." Eleanor tried to picture this woman, so different from herself and yet perhaps a kindred spirit in her strength. "I hope she likes me," she said softly. "She will," Ross assured her. "She has a soft spot for—" He broke off suddenly, his body going rigid with alertness. Eleanor froze, straining to hear what had caught Ross's attention. For a moment, there was nothing but the night sounds of the canyon, the wind in the pines, the distant call of a night bird. Then she heard it, the unmistakable clink of metal against stone, the sound of a horseshoe striking rock. Someone was approaching the canyon. Ross moved silently to the window, peering carefully around the edge of the ragged curtain. His expression confirmed Eleanor's fears before he spoke. "Riders," he whispered. "At least 4, maybe more, coming up the canyon." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "Charles, can't tell yet," Ross replied, still watching. "They're being cautious, moving slowly." He turned to her, his expression grave. "Eleanor, I need you to hide in the root cellar now. Take the small revolver and stay absolutely silent, no matter what you hear." "I can't leave you to face them alone," Eleanor protested, though fear made her voice shake. Ross gripped her shoulders gently but firmly. "This isn't a discussion. You're carrying a child, and my job is to protect you both." His voice softened slightly. "Please, Eleanor, I can focus better knowing you're safe." The concern in his eyes undid her resistance. Eleanor nodded reluctantly, allowing Ross to lead her to the trapdoor he had shown her earlier. It opened silently on well-oiled hinges, evidence that Ross had prepared this hiding place while she was tending the horses. "Stay here until I come for you," Ross instructed, helping her down the short ladder into the earthy darkness below. "If I don't come by dawn, there's a tunnel at the back that leads out to a small ravine east of the camp. Follow it, then head north. Keep the North Star on your left shoulder and you'll reach the trading post in 2 days." The matter-of-fact instructions for what to do if he died made Eleanor's throat close with emotion. "Ross," she whispered, reaching for his hand in the darkness. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "I'll be all right," he promised. "But I need to know you will be too, no matter what." He released her hand and was gone, the trapdoor closing silently above her, leaving Eleanor in darkness broken only by thin slivers of light coming through cracks in the floorboards above. She sank down onto the earthen floor, the revolver cold in her hand, and waited, listening with every fiber of her being as Ross moved around above, preparing for whatever was coming up the canyon toward them.